Hello and welcome to Western Civ. Well, today I feel truly blessed as our guest needs no introduction. Many of us fell in love with the Roman Empire reading some of his books. I recall the first time that I picked up a copy of Rubicon and simply couldn't put it down. Well, Tom Holland has a new book out, this time covering that period of Roman history that I think sometimes best captures our imagination. Talking about the golden or imperial age of Rome, from the fall of Nero in 64 AD through the end of Hadrian's reign. This is the Rome that, when we were school children, you'd look on the map and see Roman Empire at its greatest extent and marvel at what those people could do. At the same time, you'd look and read about how Rome crafted that empire and feel nothing but terror at what those people could do. Tom Holland and I talk about this and many other topics in his new book, Pax, Rome's Golden Age. It's out today. I probably don't need to tell you where to pick up a copy, but I have links in the show notes in case you'd like to check it out. I couldn't recommend the book more. Couldn't recommend any of his books any more than I already do, but this one is especially strong in my opinion. So, without further ado, here's my interview with historian Tom Holland. All right, as I mentioned moments ago, I'm sitting down here with historian Tom Holland, who needs no introduction. I'm sure most of you have a copy of one of his books on your shelf at home. I'm looking at 3 right now. So his new book, Pax, looks at the Golden Age of Rome, the high imperial period, as I like to call it sometimes. I think a lot of us who became fascinated with the Roman Empire at some point looked at the map that I did when I was a small child. This is Roman Empire at its height, and sort of wondered, how did these people achieve such unimaginable goals in the time? But one of the things that you talk about early in the book that I wanted to touch on, and one I think the most difficult conundrums, I suppose, facing somebody trying to learn about the past, or when I'm trying to talk to someone about the past, is letting go of our modern conceptions of the world. It's very difficult, I find, for some individuals to do that. And maybe even if we go vice versa, it would be hard. In the preface, you write, quote, "I've sought to portray the Romans in their imperial heyday, not as our contemporaries, not as straw men either to be emulated or condemned, but as people who command our fascination." So I wanted to start out, I suppose, with kind of a 2-part question, which is, A, what do you think it is that makes Romans, particularly the Romans of this golden era, so fascinating? And how should we understand the Romans? What is the best way to approach a people so distant from us, but somebody who is so often in the popular imagination?
Well, I think the 2 questions can be interfused. I think we find the Romans fascinating, both because they seem to be like us and because they are so alien. And so there's a sense in which the study of the Roman Empire has something of the fascination of very good science fiction, where it's precisely the fusion of the familiar with the unfamiliar that generates all the tension and the excitement. I was kind of very amused to see that this week there's been, I think it was a tweet where a woman said that she'd asked her husband, how many times do you think about the Roman Empire? And he said, at least 5 times a day or something. And now it's kind of papers in the US are running features about it and saying, is it really true? It didn't come as a surprise to me. I think about the Roman Empire all the time. But the whole kind of the joke of it is, I suppose, that the Romans are a universal object of fascination. And I think that they fascinate in part because they seem glamorous and terrifying and thrilling. And we can enjoy that because they are sufficiently distant that we don't feel implicated in what they are doing. So it is identification or fascination with more recent empires generates much more ideological tension. But the Romans seem sufficiently different. And I remember as a child, I was obsessed with dinosaurs. And if I'm honest, it was the pictures that showed predators savaging sauropods or whatever that I particularly enjoyed. And I realize now that I moved seamlessly onto a study of the Romans. And I remember the very first book of Roman history that I was given. It was Peter Connolly's book about the Roman army, and it had an illustration of the Battle of Alesia, Caesar's great victory in the Gallic Wars, on the front, and it showed various people with spears sticking out of their guts. And this seemed very Mesozoic to me in its appeal. So I would not want to downplay the fact that it is the glamour and the ferocity of the Romans. I think that is part of the appeal, and I think it's something there's something primal there. But equally, admiring empires, admiring people who had, threw people into arenas and tortured them to death, or had them fight to death for fun, who owned slaves, who had sexual morals that to us would seem unspeakably cruel. There is the question of how you attempt to understand them is obviously, as you said in your introduction, a very live issue. My own feeling is that it's not the role of historians to be philosophers or theologians or moralists. So I'm trying not to be any of those in my handling of the Romans. I'm trying to bring them alive, to enable readers to see the world through their eyes, and if not exactly to sympathize with them, at least to understand them.
And I think the understanding part is the key. Obviously, during the Imperial Age, whether that's America's Imperial Age, Great Britain's Imperial Age, the Romans were viewed a little bit differently than they might have been after, say, the World Wars, when expansionist empires were viewed maybe in not so favorable light anymore. But I do find I've always found the Romans particularly fascinating when you look at maps, but then also, I suppose, also from that sort of inspirational yet simultaneously terrifying standpoint that you point out, because they are one of the greatest slave-holding societies of all time. And what's interesting is that because they are distant, I find that it is oftentimes more easy for me to speak about the Romans critically in that way than it is to speak about, say, the antebellum American South. There's nerves that get touched there that don't seem to get touched when I talk about someone that far in the past. But as I was reading the book, one thing that sort of struck me as interesting is the transition of the city of Rome during this time period. The city of Rome physically changes very dramatically, whether we're talking about, Nero, whether or not he intentionally burns it to the ground in 64 AD-CE, whatever you want to call it, is a city that starts to mirror the expansionist power of the empire in such a more stark way than it does prior to this golden age. I wonder if you could talk about that for a second, because I thought that the transition of Rome was really something powerful.
So Augustus, in Suetonius' biography of him, famously said that he found Rome a city of brick and he left it a city of marble. And the fact that Rome, prior to the imperial period, prior to the establishment of the autocracy in Rome, was a city of brick, was a reflection of the fact precisely that it wasn't an autocracy, that there were limits set on the right and the ability of the city's great men to promote their own image by building kind of a style of architecture that for the Romans was associated with kings. So the kind of palaces and temples and public monuments that you would see in Alexandria or Antioch, which were patronized by kings, were anathema to the Romans for deep ideological reasons. But with the concentration of power in the hands of Augustus, who comes to rule as the first emperor, there's obviously enormous scope for him, because there's no one to stop him, to beautify Rome in a way that a Greek from Alexandria or Antioch would admire. What happens, the more emperors there are, the more buildings go up, because every emperor is in a position to beautify Rome. So you mentioned the fire. One of the reasons why Nero is so darkly suspected of having been complicit in the fire is precisely that it gets rid of so much building stock, housing stock, public monuments, or whatever, that Nero regarded as not being up to scratch. And so he rebuilds the urban fabric of Rome in a much more impressive way. The conceit is that he is such an enthusiast for architecture that, of course, he would burn down stuff that he didn't like. Of course he would. Now, whether that's true or not, I think that the very fact that the stories are told gives you a sense of how it is possible for some people in Rome to find this desire on the part of the emperors to monumentalize everything oppressive and upsetting and unsettling, because Rome is a very ancient city by this point. There are lots of quarters, lots of places that people have lived there for centuries and centuries and centuries, and they don't want to see it removed. But the emperors do. They want to get rid of it, and they have the power to do so. And the fire in Nero's reign, by removing so much of old Rome, does kind of provide scope for the emperors who follow Nero to complete the task that Augustus had begun. So Vespasian comes back supposedly with the loot that he's taken from Judea. I think actually that's massively exaggerated. I think most of the money that he's coming is from tax receipts that he's screwed out of people in the Eastern Empire. But it enables him to pose as an imperator or a victorious general in the old sense of the word, and to throw up these spectacular monuments. But the person who really finishes off the job is Trajan, who enables the Romans to feel that they still have what it takes when it comes to being martial, that they can march out there and they can cross great rivers and capture enemy strongholds and defeat headhunting barbarians and plunder of them of their gold and silver. And this is just like it was back in the heroic days of the Republic. So Rome still has what it's got. But at the same time, all that loot, all that plunder enables Trajan to complete the monumentalization of central Rome. And he does it on such a scale that when 200 odd years later, an emperor who's never been to Rome before, who's based in Constantinople, arrives in Rome, it's the spectacle of Trajan's Forum that leaves him awestruck. I think there's no doubt that by the end of Trajan's reign, Rome is probably the most spectacular, monumental cityscape that has ever existed. It's broader, it's larger, it's wealthier. And that is why the memory of it, I think, lives so enduringly, even when so much of it has gone. And it's why the muscle memory of that endures in the West for as long as it does. And it explains in part why Washington, D.C., for instance, looks like it does. That kind of image of the classical city, the capital of a great imperial power. We know what it should look like in the West. And that is largely thanks to the emperors of this period, and perhaps above all to Trajan.
As anybody who's been to Rome, as I've had the pleasure of doing, it is hard sometimes to go to the Forum and imagine what it must have been like. But the images are spectacular. And yes, if you've been to Washington, D.C., it's not hard to look around and think about who they're emulating. It's pretty obvious. They're not hiding. The founding fathers were not hiding the ball, when they designed this in any way.
Because otherwise there wouldn't be a Senate or a Capitol Hill.
Nope. I tell my students at the start of every year, why do you think we have a Senate? Where does that word come from? It's pretty clear. It's not. We didn't make it up. So I want to ask a little bit about the empire and its relationship to conquered peoples, because of course they are conquered peoples. And one of the quotations that I thought was really interesting from the book was, you write, and I have this kind of not quoted directly, but an implication being that everyone in the empire was destined to become, in the long run, I think you said, a kind of Rome. And I wonder about assimilation in the Roman Empire. And I wonder about it specifically right now, because as one of my own projects, I'm kind of digging into the wars of the successors right now. And I don't think assimilation was something that was on the table for them as they were thinking about how to add different parts to their empires. And for those unfamiliar, I'm talking about the successors who come after Alexander the Great in really the late third and into the second century and so on and so forth. And I just wonder, I really kind of wonder when we think about this idea of becoming Roman, was this real? Was this aspirational? Is this something that the Romans had in mind, and to what extent was it realistic for people to actually go from being a conquered people to go to feeling as though they're real citizens of the Roman Empire?
Well, right from the beginning, if we trust the legends, Rome is a city of immigrants. So Romulus, the asylum, which is on the Capitol Hill, was a place where people could come if they were criminals, if they were escaped slaves, whatever. They could go there and they could be integrated by Romulus into this novel state. And that tradition, that it was possible for people people who might not have been Roman to become Roman, is a part of the ethos of citizenship. At the same time, of course, there's chauvinism, there's hostility towards outsiders. That's the way of human societies. But it was viewed with astonishment by Greek outsiders how ready the Romans were to give away their citizenship, as the Greeks saw it. For the Greeks, I think they had a much clearer sense of the division between, say, being Greek and being barbarian than the Romans did. Of course, going into the imperial period, when Claudius starts appointing Gallic leaders as senators, there are all kinds of snobbish jokes about, will they turn up and in their trousers? But Claudius can do it because basically it's going with the grain of Roman history. Now, there's a further dimension, which you mentioned, slavery. Now, one of the differences between, say, antebellum slavery in the United States and Rome is that there isn't really a color. It's not about race. Most people in the Roman world who become slaves, who are taken to Italy to work as slaves, are from the Mediterranean. And that means that it's very easy for them to look like Romans, very easy for them to blend in. And one of the strange things about the Roman attitudes to slavery, which Greeks comment on, is how ready the Romans are to liberate their slaves, to free them. If you're a worker in the fields or in the mines, you're unlikely to be freed. You're going to be worked to death. But if you're a domestic slave, the likelihood is that you will be freed, and your children can get citizenship, and grandchildren perhaps can become magistrates, and they become richer and more prosperous. And in time, people who had been brought to Italy as slaves might end up in the Senate. Who knows? And again, this is very, very unusual. And there's a sense in which I think for slaves who are lucky in where they serve their terms of servitude, it's like working your passage to get a green card. It's an entree into Roman society. And the fact that people are being brought to Italy in such numbers from such different corners of the world, and the only identity really on offer is a Roman one, explains again, I think, how out of this great churning of enslavement and liberation, you do get a kind of Roman identity. Now, what is happening in the period covered by this book is a further thing, which is the Greek empires that you were talking about by this period have been conquered for about a century and a half, 2 centuries, 250 years. Greeks are starting to be integrated into the fabric of the empire. Native Greek speakers are coming to the Senate. And what you see particularly with the last emperor that I cover in detail, Hadrian, who was a great lover of Hellenic culture, was known as a boy as the Graeculus, as the little Greek, sponsored a kind of Hellenic equivalent of the European Union, a union of all the various rival Greek cities. And he's very enthusiastic for the notion that there is no contradiction between being culturally Greek and being a Roman, because Hadrian himself from the other side embodies that. And of course, this in a sense is the future for Rome. In the very, very, very long run, when Constantinople is captured by the Turks, the people who defend Constantinople in 1453 are Greek speakers, but they still see themselves as Roman, as Romeoi.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Slavery in the Roman world, and again, this is one of those situations where we have to be mindful of the changes that happen over time, because it's very different from American chattel slavery. In some sense, depending upon whether if you are a domestic slave, it's closer in many ways, I think, to almost indentured servitude in the New World, where it's not a forever thing, and there's no mark or badge of inferiority, as the American courts use the term, that gets stamped on you over time as a result. But I want to ask about a different Roman value. So there's assimilation, but then loyalty, as you point out in the book, is a critical part of being a Roman. And you talk about having swearing as a soldier, the sacramentum, this oath of loyalty, but you swear it, and this is the interesting part, you swear it to the empire, to Rome and the emperor. And those are different things, because those two individuals might have adverse interests at some point. And this all comes to a head in the year of the four emperors. And I think that's interesting about the Roman Empire too, is how it goes through different dynasties. This Ptolemies, rule Egypt undisputably until Cleopatra's demise. The Achaemenids rule, the golden age of Persia until Alexander the Great shows up in an unbroken line. The Julio-Claudians die off relatively quickly in Roman terms.
Well, in part, they kill each other off. That's true. The thing. They kill each. That's kind of, Caligula and Nero are busy removing anyone who might be their rivals. I think you're right in identifying the death of Nero, who is the last living descendant of Augustus, to die, meaning that there is no one left with the divine blood of Augustus in his veins. So the significance of Augustus as the man who had saved Rome, who had established the monarchy, who had risen up into the heavens, on the readiness of the Roman people to accept the monarchy, I think is overwhelming. And that means that when Nero dies, the question that has to be asked is, well, who can legitimately claim now to rule the Roman world? And the attempt to answer that question sees four emperors in very rapid succession in the fateful year AD 69, the year of four emperors, succeed each other. And it points to what you were saying with the sacramentum, the foundations of the emperor's power, but also of the stability of the empire itself. Despite the show of magistracies and civilian life and so on, ultimately it is a military autocracy. Without professional armies, it would be nothing. And we are so habituated, I think, to the idea of there being a Roman army that perhaps we are a little anesthetized to how strange this was. Nothing like it had existed before. It hadn't really existed before the time of Augustus. It's Augustus who, as the last man left standing after the terrible cycles of civil wars that had destroyed the Republic, he lays claim to the command of all the legions in his role as a magistrate of the Roman people. And that's why the soldiers swear the oath to him as the ultimate commander-in-chief. The commanders in station of the legions are his legati, his legates, his delegates. That's their role. So all these armies supposedly are loyal to the one man. Of course, what happens in the year of the four emperors is that you get different people in different corners of the empire who have armies that they can get behind them. And the result is, for a year, incessant bloodshed. So you have the armies in Spain backing one guy, you have the armies on the Rhine backing another guy, you have the armies in the east backing another guy. And this is such a catastrophic situation for not just Rome, but for the entire sweep of the world that she rules, that briefly in that year, people are thinking, well, have the gods abandoned Rome? Is the empire going to fall to pieces? Is anarchy going to claim the universe? The fact that it doesn't, I think, shows that actually the challenges facing the Roman order, even with the extinction of the bloodline of Augustus, are not so great that all the convulsions of AD 69 in the long run serve only as surface froth. The foundations of Roman power are sufficiently deep that within a few decades, the memories of that terrible year are already starting to fade.
And the winner of the Year of the Four Emperors, Vespasian, I'm always curious about him in that did the best man win that brief period of civil war, or did Vespasian just get lucky and everybody else knocked each other off, and then he had the opportunity to take on maybe arguably the weakest of his opponents?
I think both. I think he clearly was lucky. He was lucky principally in that the Judeans rebelled in the final years of Nero's reign, and he was sent out to suppress the rebellion, which meant that he had a whole host of battle-hardened legions at his back, just as the Year of the Four Emperors kicked off, which was obviously very useful thing to have. But I think he was also by miles the ablest. He was, I think, a very impressive man. He was the only one of the four emperors in that year who could properly be reckoned an imperator in both senses of the word. So imperator in the sense that it gives us the English word emperor, but also imperator in the original Latin sense of a victorious general, a general who's been triumphant on the battlefield. Vespasian was both, and he was able to come back to cast himself as a figure of military rectitude and probity, a kind of throwback. He himself was from peasant stock from the hills north of Rome, so he had no kind of aristocratic pedigree whatsoever. But the very fact that he was able to cast himself as of peasant stock enabled him to play a kind of a figure of republican virtue, as well as a very impressive military leader, and that's what enabled him to rule for 10 years, to set Rome back on its foundations, to heal the wounds of peace, and to establish a dynasty that would last for another 20 years after his death. So I think he was a very, very formidable man. And I think of the four men who compete in that year, the most appealing as well. So it was said of him that he had an expression like a man straining for a shit. And anyone who's ever looked at a portrait bust of Vespasian will see that this was a very accurate comment. And the great thing about Vespasian is that when he was told this, he laughed. He was a man who could take a joke by and large. And that's always, I think, an appealing quality in an emperor.
Yeah, I guess I've always admired Vespasian, because anybody who can come out of that Civil War period and establish that level of stability again must be, by definition, impressive. People do get lucky, but no one gets that lucky. I'm also interested about his two sons, Titus and Domitian, because Titus rules, but not very long, and dies of the plague, and I sometimes compare the two of them to almost like, in American politics, JFK and LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, because LBJ gets this bad comparison. He has to follow JFK, who wasn't president for very long, because he dies, and he has this wonderful leader who, if only he would have lived, and to an extent, Domitian looks in the sources sometimes terrible by comparison to Titus, but I wonder, is that
absolutely
true?
Terrible? Yeah,
is that true, or did he just get bad press?
So Domitian, I think, is labouring under a number of disadvantages, and the greatest of them is the fact that he is not, as Vespasian had been, and as Titus had been, an imperator in the sense of a victorious general, because Vespasian had suppressed the Judean revolt pretty much, and Titus finishes it off by capturing Jerusalem and, of course, notoriously destroying the temple. And this gives them a kind of a military glamour that no one had really had ruling Rome since the time of Tiberius. Now, Vespasian and Titus both massively exaggerate their achievements in Judea. They cast it not as the suppression of a revolt, but as a great conquest, which licensed them to celebrate a triumph. They imply that Judea was a land teeming with wealth, and that this is what enables them to build, most famously, the Colosseum. I don't think that's true. There wasn't that much wealth in Judea. I think most of it, as I said, was extorted from the Greeks. But it gives both of them a glamour. And because Titus is younger than Vespasian, he can kind of play the JFK, as you say. Domitian can't really do that. And he comes to power, I think, resentful of that. He clearly was not an appealing character. He seems to have been widely disliked on a personal level. And I think that feeds into the sources. There's another reason, however, why the memory of Domitian is a black one that is more flattering, I think, to his actual achievements. And that is that he was a committed reformer who was unafraid to break a few eggs to make an omelette. So Domitian very much feels that he's an emperor coming to power in crisis. And he is, I think, understandably convinced that the Romans have lost the favor of the gods. They've lost it because the era of the four emperors showed how close the empire was to coming to utter disaster, because in the reign of Titus, a succession of disasters had overwhelmed Rome. Its most significant building, the temple to Jupiter on the Capitol, had burned down for the second time in a period of 10 years. A plague had hit the city, which, as you said, seems to have carried off Titus. And most famously and notoriously of all, the Vesuvius had erupted and entombed Pompeii and Herculaneum. And I think that Domitian feels that all of these are signs that something is badly wrong in Rome, and that it's his duty as Caesar to re-establish the bond, the religio, as the Romans called it, between the Roman people and the gods. And he does this in all kinds of ways. He acts as a moral arbiter. He he sticks his nose into all kinds of aspects of personal morality that generates all kinds of resentment. He's also very, very committed to strengthening the currency. So although he is bald, he always shows himself on his coins with a full head of hair. And this isn't just, I think, out of personal vanity, although I'm sure that's a bit of it, but because he's using this to illustrate the strength of the currency that he has restored. And he builds up the military forces on the frontiers. And all of this is a legacy that he passes on to the emperors who follow him. When Domitian dies, for the reasons I've spelled out, he's unpopular, and so his statues are trashed, his memory is blackened. But when we come to Trajan, this man who rebuilds Rome on the monumental scale, as we were discussing, it would have been impossible for Trajan to do what he did without the legacy that he had been bequeathed by Domitian, the strong currency and the concentration of military power along the Danube that enables him to conquer Dacia, this gold and silver rich land up in what's now Romania. So I think that Domitian is an unsympathetic figure, but an impressive figure.
And I think it's worth pointing out that reformers are rarely loved by those who are presently in power, as those who are presently in power have to sometimes foot the bill for said reforms. But and I've always admired Domitian a little bit more than the sources have been willing to give him credit for. We have to keep in mind who's writing here. Some of his reforms certainly benefited the empire in the long run, even though they may have been resented by the aristocracy, who is, of course.
So were you sympathetic sympathetic to my portrayal of him then?
I was sympathetic. I thought that it was a little bit more balanced than a lot of the portrayals that I've read in the past.
Good. I'm very glad.
Yeah, I appreciated it. I mean, and the person who we'll get to next is Trajan, and it's easy to love him. It's much more difficult.
I don't like Hadrian. I didn't like Trajan at all.
But it's easy.
I mean,
it's easy to admire
him, I guess.
He's called Optimus from the very beginning. He's called the Great before, the best, before he's practically even done anything. I mean, it's interesting. And that's kind of the question that I wanted to ask about Trajan is, he's in so many histories laid out as the best Roman emperor. And I often wonder about that. Is he the best Roman emperor? There's a lot to choose from here. And yes, it's the highest extent, but does that make him the best? I don't know.
Well, he impresses very, very stern critics. And I guess the sternest critic would be the great historian Tacitus, whose portraits of the various Caesars are pretty merciless. But Tacitus seems to admire Trajan because Trajan seemed to offer reassurance to Tacitus that actually the Romans hadn't lost it. Tacitus was paranoid that Rome's greatness was breeding a softness in the Roman people that would make it impossible for them to have the kind of the record of conquest and military achievement that had been the Romans back when they were a hardier, lesser people. But the conquest of Dacia seemed to Tacitus to say, well, this isn't actually true. The Romans are still the Romans. Hurrah. And the fact, of course, that Trajan can then use all this loot to beautify Rome, as we were discussing, this is also great. So it looks like you can have your cake and eat it. You can be incredibly rich and have loads of baths and all kinds of stuff while simultaneously going out and conquering Dacians. So brilliant. Everything's wonderful. What's not to like? The problem is that Trajan goes too far and he does what everyone in 21st century America knows you should never do and invades Iraq. And the invasion of Iraq for Trajan, as for George W. Bush, doesn't end well. And in fact, Trajan has a stroke. There's a massive insurgency going on. Trajan dies, and it's left to his successor, Hadrian, to clear up the mess, which Hadrian does with great skill. He basically withdraws from Mesopotamia, but he never blames Trajan because he knows that Trajan is admired and loved, and he knows also that his own legitimacy as emperor kind of depends on Trajan being admired and loved. So no one ever blames Trajan for the fact that he basically screwed up by pushing too far. The blame, such as it is, falls on Hadrian, which is very unfair. But I think that the disaster in Iraq means that Trajan cannot possibly be reckoned an unmitigated success. I think the Romans were deluding themselves. They liked what they saw in him. He was their model of what an emperor should be. But their enshrining of him as the Optimus Princeps, the best of emperors, depended on them closing their eyes to the disaster that claimed the end of his reign.
And does that sort of get into the question of, does Trajan answer the question of can the Roman Empire expand forever? And the answer is no at the end of the day.
I think he does. Yeah.
Because it just
the Romans never acknowledge this. They never acknowledge this. They have, the Romans don't really have a word for frontier. There are simply lands that they choose not to conquer. And this is very much what the perspective that Hadrian brings. So there are walls built along the kind of the desert reaches of Africa, bordering the Sahara. A great wooden palisade is built beyond the limits of the Rhine to keep the Germans out. And most famously of all, a wall is built out of stone in the northern reaches of the province of Britannia. And that wall is conventionally thought of as a defensive structure. So the most famous recent evocation of it is in Game of Thrones. George R.R. Martin visited Hadrian's Wall on a trip to Britain and transfigured it into this great wall of ice with, White Walkers and whatever lurking beyond it. That's not the purpose at all. Hadrian's Wall exists as a statement of contempt and power for those who lie beyond it and of Roman power. That's why there are no ramparts on it. It's not there to keep Picts and Scots out. It's akin to massive gates barring entry, say, to a billionaire's estate, keeping the riffraff, the poor, the tramps, the down and outs. They are not worthy of passing. It's like a massive it's like the gates of a gated community. And what Hadrian is saying by building Hadrian's Wall is this is the outermost limits of what Rome thinks is worth conquering. Everywhere beyond it doesn't deserve to be ruled by Rome. Everything south of it, this is the garden of the world. This is where peace and order exists, and it is ours, and nobody else can have it, a part of it. And that's what those fortifications are about.
Yeah, and Hadrian has always struck me as right. Quite frankly, that there just simply, there just simply isn't. If you kind of look at the map of Rome under Hadrian, and you think, well, how much further? can
what's
we
left
go?
to conquer?
What? Yeah. Sail
Who wants
Norway?
Scotland?
I mean, what's the point of this? What's in the deep dark forests of what is today modern day Germany and Poland and beyond? Not mountains of gold. It strikes me as, you write that Hadrian is the most intellectual emperor since Tiberius. And I don't know, does that make him more reasonable? How does that? How should we understand him? Because I've always admired him a lot.
I think by temperament, this was noted by people who wrote about him, that he seemed to be a compound of paradoxes, that he was capable of being many things simultaneously. And I suppose the aspect of his appearance that famously illustrates this is his beard, because he's the first emperor to be portrayed regularly with a beard. And a beard is a marker of a legionary. And so it establishes Hadrian as, one of the lads, a vir militaris, a military man, a man whom the legionaries can identify with. And Hadrian is massively popular with them. When he goes on his great tours of the legionary bases, he would never expect the legionaries to do things that he himself isn't going to do. So he goes around bareheaded. He accompanies them on their marches. He eats their rations. He's much loved by the legionaries. But at the same time, a beard is the marker of a philosopher. We already talked about how Hadrian is a great sponsor of Greek culture, and he, in that sense, he's simultaneously, a working class military man. And he is a kind of a foreign style intellectual. He drives a truck and he reads the New York Times. I mean, it's kind of, it's that equivalent. It's spanning Trump's base and, liberals in Harvard. He's able to present himself simultaneously as both, and that's obviously a tremendous political talent. And I think that he's the most remarkable of emperors since, I think, Augustus, because he's not afraid of the paradoxes and the tensions and the complexities within the empire as it has grown up, but sees them as things that are worth cultivating. And in a sense, the most dramatic illustration of that is his sponsorship as a god of his dead lover, a boy called Antonius, who is Greek, dies in mysterious circumstances in the Nile, and is raised to the heavens by Hadrian and becomes a genuine object of cult worship across much of the Eastern Empire. I think because people in the eastern half of the empire can look at Antonius and think, well, he was loved by an emperor. He's closer to us than to anyone else. Much more than, say, Augustus or someone like that. And in that sense, is even a bit of a rival to Christ. And it's telling that of all the pagan gods that the church fathers had it in for, Antonius seems to have been the one they really hated.
Yeah, go figure. Go figure. I'm always going to wrap up here in just a second, but I'm always interested because Hadrian takes this tour of the empire, and I'm always struck by the fact that he seems to be the only one who does it. What is that? I mean, maybe you've kind of already answered this question.
Augustus had done it. So it was Suetonius notes that I think it's he of all the provinces in the empire, I think the only one that Augustus hadn't visited was Sardinia, maybe Africa as well. But, so Augustus had constantly been on the road. But you're right, from that point onwards, Hadrian is exceptional.
And maybe more exceptional. Maybe who do you think's a better emperor, Hadrian or Trajan? I kind of have a sense which way you're going.
Oh, Hadrian. Hadrian is, I think, by miles the better emperor. I think most emperors are not consequential. I think that what happens would have happened without them at all. I think Hadrian is a consequential emperor because of the role that he plays in finessing the integration of the Hellenic into the Roman, creating the Greco-Roman, if you like.
Very good. Well, this has been a great conversation. Is there anything there's a lot more in the book, obviously, but it's clocks in it, I believe, 1 page shy of 400 pages. So we've got a lot more to go.
But every page a banger.
I'll have to say, we didn't talk about it at all, but I will say for the edification of those listening, I've never read a more gripping description of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. I simply couldn't put it down for a few pages.
Thank you.
I thought it was phenomenal, and oftentimes glossed over. But thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful
Thanks so much
conversation.
for having me.
And I know the book's going to do well as all the other books have, and I can't recommend it enough. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. Bye-bye.